When the boy lined up for the marathon, excitement buzzed in the air. Runners stretched, adjusted their shoes, and looked ahead toward the long road that would test every ounce of their endurance. He was young, smaller than most of the participants, but his eyes carried a determination that many overlooked. The moment he stepped into the lineup, however, he heard the sting of words that cut deeper than any muscle cramp ever could. "Get out of the way," someone muttered, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a distraction. Another voice followed, sharper, with a tone soaked in disbelief, questioning why he was even there at all. To them, he wasn't a competitor, he was an obstacle. The boy stood still for a moment, letting those words echo in his mind. Around him, adults adjusted their earbuds, tightened their shoelaces, and prepared for the challenge. None of them expected him to belong. Some even gave him a smirk, a look that said he'd be out of breath before the first mile was done. The words weren't just noise. They were meant to push him down, to shove him into a place where he felt small, invisible, and unworthy of standing on the same ground as them. For many, words like that can leave scars, carving doubts that last far longer than the race itself. It wasn't just about the race. Those words carried the weight of generations of assumptions. To be told to step aside, to be told that his place wasn't here, wasn't new to him. He had heard whispers before in schoolyards, in grocery stores, in moments when people thought he was too young to understand. But now, here in front of the world, it was blunt, loud, and unavoidable. He knew that for them, this marathon wasn't his stage, wasn't his battle to win. They believed he should fade into the background, just another face they would forget once the race began. The boy didn't answer them. He didn't push back with words, he didn't shout, and he didn't defend himself. Instead, he stood in silence, gripping the moment tightly in his chest. Inside him, anger flickered, but so did pride. He wasn't just running for himself. He was running for every time someone said he didn't belong, for every moment he was underestimated, for every time someone tried to push him aside. Their dismissal became fuel, and their disbelief became fire. But in that instant before the starting gun went off, he also felt something else, an ache. He was just a kid who wanted to run. He didn't come here to make a statement. He didn't come here to prove anything to strangers. He loved the sound of his feet hitting the ground, the rhythm of his breathing, the freedom of running. Yet here he was, forced to carry more than just his own body down the road. He was carrying their doubt, their judgment, their prejudice. That was the real weight pressing on his shoulders. He lowered his head, looked at the ground for a moment, and thought about stopping. It would be easy to step back, to avoid the stares, to pretend it didn't matter. But then he remembered the hours he had spent running through his neighborhood, the mornings when the world was still quiet, and it felt like he was flying, the afternoons when he pushed himself through exhaustion while others rested. He knew he had prepared. He knew what his body was capable of, and he knew that if he let their voices stop him now, he would regret it long after the race was over. The starting line wasn't just a line on the pavement anymore. It became a boundary between who they thought he was and who he knew he could be. Each insult replayed in his head, but instead of weakening him, it wrapped around him like armor. He could feel the crowd's eyes on him, some with doubt, others with curiosity, but very few with belief. And he accepted that. Belief wasn't something they had to give him. It was something he carried within himself. The official lifted the starter pistol, and in that split second of silence before the sound cracked through the air, the boy closed his eyes. He heard the voices one more time, sharp and unrelenting. "Get out of the way." And instead of shrinking, he let them settle deep inside, not as chains, but as a spark that would carry him forward. The gun fired, the runners surged, and the race began. As the runners surged forward, the rhythm of pounding feet filled the air. The boy's body fell into motion, but the echoes of doubt still lingered behind him, carried not just in words but in the way people looked at him. Doubt has a language of its own, and it doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. It was there in the dismissive glances cast his way, in the slight shake of a head from someone who couldn't believe he was still keeping pace, in the muttered chuckles exchanged by those who thought the race would break him before the first water station. To them, he was out of place. They had trained for months, some for years, and here was a boy who, in their eyes, didn't belong among real runners. Every step he took seemed to feed their disbelief. Some runners veered slightly to the side when passing him, almost as if his presence was an inconvenience, as though sharing the same road with him somehow disrespected the marathon itself. Others slowed down when they caught sight of him, not because they were tired, but because they wanted to confirm with their own eyes that he was really there, really trying, really daring to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. They couldn't understand why he hadn't stopped after being told to move aside, why he hadn't accepted what they believed to be his place. The doubt wasn't just coming from the runners. Along the sidelines, a few spectators clapped with polite encouragement, but many didn't bother to hide their surprise. Some leaned in to whisper to one another, their eyes following him as if he were some kind of anomaly. Their expressions weren't filled with hope or excitement. They were filled with expectation of failure. They expected him to collapse, to slow down, to give up. For them, it wasn't a question of if, but when. But the boy knew doubt well. He had seen it in classrooms when teachers underestimated his potential. He had felt it in stores where strangers assumed he couldn't afford what he was looking at. He had heard it in the way people sometimes spoke to him with a tone soaked in condescension, as if his worth needed to be measured and weighed before they could decide how much respect to give. Here, on this road, that same doubt had simply put on running shoes and lined up beside him. It wasn't new, but it was heavy, pressing down on him with every glance, every whisper, every assumption. What the doubters didn't realize was that doubt can be dangerous. Not always for the one who receives it, but for the ones who give it. Doubt has a way of pushing people past their limits, of sharpening their focus, of fueling a fire that no amount of training can prepare someone to match. The boy could feel that fire building inside of him with each mile. Where others saw an underdog, he began to feel the steady rise of something greater, a force that would not be stopped simply because someone thought he didn't belong. Still, that didn't mean the doubt didn't sting. Every sneer, every laugh, every patronizing pat on the back before the race had started, it was all replaying in his mind as his legs carried him forward. He wasn't immune to the weight of it. Doubt is heavy because it doesn't just question your ability. It tries to question your right to even try. And as he ran, he could feel that weight clinging to him, slowing his breathing, testing his resolve. He thought of quitting again, not because his legs were weak, but because the constant storm of doubt tried to convince him that proving himself wasn't worth the pain. But quitting would mean they were right. Quitting would mean that the voices and the stares and the disbelief had been justified. He knew if he stopped now, if he let their doubt define him, then every word they had spoken would live on long after the race was over. That thought alone tightened his fists and straightened his posture. He didn't run faster to silence them. He ran faster because he refused to silence himself. Every runner around him had trained their bodies, but he was training something else entirely. He was testing the strength of his will against the storm of their disbelief. He could hear their breathing change as the miles stretched on, some of the confident footsteps faltering, some of the mocking faces now showing the first signs of strain. Yet still, the doubt didn't disappear. It clung stubbornly, like a shadow, trying to convince him that his endurance was temporary, that his strength was fleeting, that soon he would fall back into the place they had assigned him. The fire didn't begin with the race. It had been burning long before the crowd, long before the runners, long before the starter's gun. It came from years of being told he wasn't enough, from hearing voices that tried to place limits on him before he ever had the chance to test himself. When he felt the sting of those words at the starting line, when he heard the sneers and saw the smirks, the fire that already lived inside of him only grew hotter. It wasn't the kind of fire that blazed out of control, though. It was the kind that smoldered, steady and focused, waiting for the right moment to rise and consume every doubt that had ever been thrown his way. As the race unfolded, that fire turned into rhythm. Each foot striking the ground became a drumbeat. Each breath another gust of wind feeding the flames. Other runners had energy gels, fancy watches, perfectly planned pacing strategies. He had something they couldn't measure. He had something that couldn't be bought, borrowed, or calculated. His fuel wasn't found in sports science. It was born out of every insult, every dismissal, every time someone made him feel small. And as he pushed forward, the fire didn't weaken him. It made him relentless. There was pain, of course. His legs screamed, his chest burned, his shoulders ached with the weight of the effort. But pain was nothing new. Pain was something he had learned to carry long before this race. It had shown up when he stayed up late practicing in the dark streets while others slept. It showed up when he was laughed at for even daring to dream bigger than the boundaries people tried to place around him. Compared to that, the pain in his muscles felt almost welcome, almost like proof that he was still pushing, still moving, still refusing to break. The fire inside didn't just push him forward, it kept his head lifted. It wouldn't allow him to shrink in the face of doubters. Every time someone's disbelief tried to seep into his spirit, the fire burned it away. He thought about the children who might one day hear this story. Kids who would face the same sneers and whispers. Kids who would be told they didn't belong. If he let the voices win, if he let the doubt consume him, then he would be feeding the very fire that others tried to use against people like him. But if he kept going, if he let his determination carry him forward, then maybe those kids would see something else. Maybe they would see what happens when someone chooses not to be defined by doubt, but by the fire they carry inside. As the miles stretched on, the other runners began to show cracks. Their breathing grew heavier, their strides less confident. Some slowed down, some stumbled, and some glanced at him with disbelief as he continued to surge forward. That fire inside him was not something they could understand. They had never been told to move aside simply because of who they were. They had never felt the sting of being underestimated before they even started. Their strength came from training alone. His came from something deeper, something carved into his very being. The fire made him sharper, too. Every sound became clearer, the steady rhythm of his shoes against the pavement, the cheering of spectators, even the quiet gasps of those who had thought he would be gone by now. He didn't need to look back to know that some of the very people who had doubted him were now trailing behind. He could feel it. He could sense the shift in the air, the moment when mockery turned into silence. And though he didn't allow himself to smile, the fire inside of him glowed hotter. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone, but he also wasn't there to be humiliated. He knew that fire could burn out if he let anger take control, so he used it carefully. He didn't sprint recklessly. He paced himself, steady, deliberate, with each stride fueled by more than just muscle. He ran with purpose, with a quiet defiance that grew louder with every mile. The fire inside wasn't about rage, it was about resilience. It was about proving that no matter how many times someone told him he wasn't enough, he would rise and rise again. The boy thought of every early morning when he laced his shoes while the world was still asleep. He thought of the afternoons when he had nothing but the road and his breath to keep him company. Those moments, unseen and uncelebrated, had built this fire. They had built a furnace of discipline, determination, and focus. And now, in the middle of this marathon, surrounded by people who never thought he would last, that furnace was blazing bright enough to light his way forward. The road stretched ahead like an endless test, winding through the city streets with crowds pressing in on both sides. At first, the voices of doubt still clung to him, faint but persistent, like shadows that refused to let go. But with every stride, something began to change. He felt the rhythm of his body aligning with the rhythm of the race. And soon he noticed he wasn't just keeping up. He was moving past people. One by one, runners who had laughed or looked at him with disbelief began to fall behind. The boy didn't taunt them, didn't look back to see their faces, but he could feel the silence growing heavier with every step he took forward. There is always a turning point in a race, a moment when the body either begins to falter or finds another gear, and for him, that moment came when he overtook the first cluster of runners who had once dismissed him. They had started strong, their confidence visible in their long strides and steady pace. But now they struggled to maintain what had once seemed effortless. As he passed them, he didn't hear the jeers anymore. He didn't hear the casual mockery. Instead, there was only the sound of breathing, ragged and uneven, the sound of disbelief settling in. The silence of the crowd grew more noticeable as well. Earlier, whispers had followed him, questions about how long he would last, when he would fall behind. But now, those whispers began to fade into something else, curiosity. People leaned forward, eyes widening, realizing that the boy who was told to get out of the way wasn't just still in the race. He was climbing through it, leaving behind the very people who had doubted him. The shift wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like a storm cloud being peeled away to reveal the light behind it. But the boy felt it all the same. He didn't allow himself to celebrate, though. He knew the race was long, and he knew that the fire inside of him needed to be steady, not reckless. Still, each runner he passed fueled him more than any cheering crowd could have. Every person he overtook was a reminder that the words meant to keep him down had only made him stronger. Doubt had been their weapon, but it had become his fuel, and now he was turning it back against them, stride after stride. The road tilted upward into a hill, and here was where the true test began. Many runners faltered on inclines, their energy drained, their pace broken. He pressed harder, letting the hill become his proving ground. One runner tried to surge ahead of him, as if refusing to accept being overtaken by a boy they had dismissed. But the boy didn't falter. His stride was steady, his breath controlled, his focus unshaken. He passed the runner on the incline, and in that moment, he could feel the doubt from earlier crumbling into something else. Respect, even if it went unspoken. The silence that replaced laughter was not empty. It carried weight. It was the silence of realization, the silence that comes when a story changes direction before people's very eyes. Those who had doubted now found themselves unable to speak, unable to explain what they were seeing. They had written the ending before the race began, and now that ending was being torn apart with every step he took. That silence was louder than any insult, louder than any dismissive word. It was the sound of the world being forced to watch what they never believed possible. As he moved deeper into the pack of runners, the energy shifted again. Some tried to keep up with him, their pride unwilling to let them fall behind. But the boy ran with something different inside of him, something they couldn't match. He wasn't simply racing against bodies on the road. He was racing against the weight of every moment he had ever been told he wasn't enough. For him, this wasn't just a marathon. It was a battle of dignity, of belonging, of showing that the starting line had never been the measure of his worth. The boy could feel the fire inside him grow brighter with each runner he left behind. The sneers that once pressed on him like chains were now being transformed into fuel, into the very thing propelling him forward. He didn't run with anger. He ran with clarity, with purpose, with the simple but unshakable truth that he belonged here, that his place was not on the sidelines, not behind anyone, but right here in stride with the best of them. And as the silence deepened, as the crowd shifted from disbelief to awe, he knew the turning point had come. The boy who was told to get out of the way was no longer in anyone's way. He was the one setting the pace, the one others struggled to follow, the one changing the very story that had been written about him before the race even began. The final stretch of a marathon is unlike anything else. The air feels heavier, the body aches in places that don't even seem possible, and the mind begins to whisper that it would be easier to stop, easier to slow down, easier to accept that you've already gone far enough. For the boy, those whispers were there too, but they were drowned out by something louder. The steady roar of determination that had been growing inside of him since the first moment someone told him to move aside. He had carried their doubt like a weight on his back, but now that weight had turned into wings. The road ahead was his alone, and he was no longer running among the pack. He was leading. Every step carried a sense of clarity. The runners who had started with confidence now trailed far behind, their faces twisted with exhaustion, their breaths sharp and uneven. He didn't need to look back to know where they were. He could feel the distance widening with every stride. The boy who had once been told to get out of the way was now the one no one could keep up with. The sound of his feet hitting the ground was the only rhythm that mattered, and the stretch of road ahead felt like it was opening itself just for him. Spectators who had doubted him in the beginning now leaned forward, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had expected to see him fade into the background, swallowed by stronger, older, more experienced runners. Instead, they were watching a story unfold that none of them had written. The crowd's energy began to shift. The silence of disbelief gave way to gasps of surprise, and then slowly to cheers that built louder and louder as he surged forward. Some clapped, some shouted encouragement, but all of them were witnessing something they hadn't thought possible. The boy's face was a mixture of pain and focus. Sweat dripped down, his arms pumped with rhythm, and his legs felt like they were carrying more than just his body. They were carrying every moment of his journey, every memory of being underestimated, every sting of doubt that had ever been thrown his way. He wasn't just running a race anymore. He was rewriting the story of who he was, and no one could deny it now. As the finish line drew closer, the air thickened with tension. Every race has its champions, its heroes, the names everyone expects to see at the front. But now it was him, the boy who had been told he didn't belong. He could hear the thundering footsteps of those still chasing, but they were faint, distant, fading further with every stride. He didn't let himself slow down. He didn't allow himself to glance back. Looking back meant giving doubt room to catch him, and he had left that behind miles ago. His eyes were locked forward, fixed on the line that separated struggle from triumph. The closer he came, the more the roar of the crowd swelled. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to make sure they could see. Reporters at the sidelines scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras clicking furiously as if they feared the boy might vanish into memory if they didn't capture every frame. The energy became electric, pulsing through the street, through the runners, through the boy himself. For the first time, he wasn't just running against doubt. He was running towards something greater, something that would prove not only to the crowd, but to himself that he had always belonged. His strides lengthened, his arms swung with power, and his breathing, though labored, held steady. Pain was still there, clawing at his muscles, screaming for him to slow down, but it was powerless against the force of his will. He thought back to the starting line, to the words that had tried to push him out of this moment, and he realized that every insult, every dismissal, had led him here. Without those voices, he might not have found this fire, might not have discovered how much strength lived inside of him. The runners behind him tried to rally, some digging deep for one last surge, but it was too late. He had already created too much distance, already built too much momentum. The boy who wasn't supposed to last a single mile was now the one who couldn't be caught. His shoes pounded against the pavement like thunder, his heart raced like a drumbeat calling him forward, and the finish line stood waiting, closer with each breath. The disbelief in the eyes of the crowd had now transformed into awe. No one told him to get out of the way anymore. No one whispered that he didn't belong. In this moment, there was no debate, no dismissal, no doubt left to cling to. There was only the undeniable truth of a boy who had been underestimated, a boy who had been told he wasn't enough, now running at the front, leaving every runner, every sneer, every doubt in the dust behind him. When the boy's feet finally crossed the line, the sound that erupted around him wasn't the same as it had been at the beginning. The race had started with murmurs of doubt, whispers questioning his place, and voices telling him to step aside. Now, the noise was thunderous, a mixture of cheers, disbelief, and admiration that could no longer be contained. The same crowd that had once dismissed him was now on its feet, eyes wide and voices raised, because they had witnessed something they hadn't expected. They had seen a boy transform their doubt into power, their disbelief into proof, their prejudice into a lesson. For the boy, the finish line wasn't just about winning. It wasn't even about proving himself to those who had doubted him. It was about showing that their words didn't define him, that their assumptions had no power over the truth of what he could do. Every runner he left behind was more than just a competitor. It was a symbol of every limitation the world had tried to place on him. He hadn't just outrun people that day. He had outrun doubt, bias, and the weight of expectations that were never his to carry. The crowd's reaction mattered, but what mattered more was the silence that followed their cheers, the silence that came when realization set in. People weren't just clapping for speed. They were clapping for resilience, for strength, for the undeniable truth that talent and determination cannot be measured by age, by size, or by the color of someone's skin. That silence carried the lesson deeper than any shout could. It reminded everyone watching that what they had assumed at the starting line was not just wrong, it was unjust. Children in the crowd leaned forward, their eyes lighting up with possibility. They saw someone who looked like them, someone young, someone underestimated, achieve something no one believed he could. In their hearts, a seed was planted, a belief that they, too, could rise above the voices that tried to silence them. Parents whispered to their children, pointing to the boy as he stood, chest heaving, sweat dripping, yet unbroken. That moment became more than a race. It became a story that would live beyond the finish line, a story that would remind people of the power of resilience long after the cheers faded. The runners who had mocked him earlier, who had smirked at the thought of him even daring to stand at the line, now stood behind him in exhaustion, staring at the back of the boy who had proven them wrong. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence said enough. It was the silence of recognition, the silence that comes when arrogance crumbles and truth takes its place. Their disbelief had been shattered, and in its place was a respect they hadn't thought they would give. The lesson was not just for the runners. It was for the crowd, for the organizers, for every person who had ever assumed someone's worth before giving them a chance. The boy hadn't just run with his legs. He had run with history, with the weight of every moment people like him were told to step aside. He showed that strength doesn't come from being given permission to belong. Strength comes from refusing to be moved, from standing tall in the face of dismissal, from running forward even when the world says you can't. He hadn't spoken a single word to those who doubted him, but his run was louder than any voice. It shouted a truth that couldn't be ignored. Never underestimate someone because of who they are, where they come from, or how they look. The boy had been told to get out of the way, but instead, he created his own way, carving a path so undeniable that no one could question it anymore. His stride was more than movement, it was defiance. His finish was more than victory, it was a lesson. The story of that marathon would not just be about a boy who ran fast. It would be about a boy who turned every insult into fuel, every doubt into fire, and every barrier into a stepping stone. It would be about a boy who showed that resilience always outruns prejudice, and that no voice, no matter how loud, can silence the determination of someone who refuses to be underestimated.